My name is Helen Porter and I am the Research Support Manager at LSE Library, and I have co-organised and will facilitate this event with my colleagues who will introduce themselves now. So over to you, Sophie, Cecile and Natalie.
Thank you, Helen. So hello, everyone. Good afternoon. And for those of you just joining us, welcome again. My name is Sophie Forcadell, and I work as the Open Science Coordinator at Sciences Po Library. So my job is to foster open science at my institution through information, awareness, discussion, and training. Through this first CIVICA Research project, we are working with our partners to build and sustain a community of experts and practitioners dedicated to open science, and to build a strong and ambitious CIVICA-wide action plan. So just before handing over to Cecile, my colleague, please note that a recorded version of this webinar will be available afterwards. And yes, we would love to hear from you during this event, so do not hesitate to use the chat feature. And I'm still making sure that everyone is able to do so. Thank you. So maybe Cecile, do you want to take the floor?
Thank you, Sophie. So hello, everyone. I'm Cecile Tuitou. I'm in charge of assessment surveys and prospective at Sciences Po Library. And for the past 6 months, I've joined Sophie in the coordination of CIVICA Research at Sciences Po Library, where about 15 colleagues are involved for part of that time in different work packages in which we are working. So maybe Natalie, if you want.
Hi everyone, my name is Nathalie Cornet and I work at the LSE Library. I work in Helen's team and I'm the Research Information Analyst.
Natalie, so as Sophie has said, this event's come into being as part of the Horizon 2020 funded CIVICA Research project, which includes a dedicated work package to build an ambitious open science action plan across our CIVICA institutions. We'll be introducing some of those plans later on in the event, but for now I'd like to welcome Professor Susanna Morato, Pro-Director for Research at LSE, and the CIVICA Open Science Work Package Leader to formally introduce the event. So over to you, Susanna.
Thank you so much, Helen, and hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to our first CIVICA Open Science event. So I'm Susanna Morato, as Helen said, Pro-Director for Research at LSE, and I'm also a professor in environmental economics, and I have the pleasure of leading this work package on open science of the CIVICA project. So CIVICA is an alliance of 8 leading European higher education institutions in the social sciences, for those of you who might not know. So, I mean, the open science movement, also known as the democratization of research, has been steadily growing over the past 5–10 years. But it was really the COVID pandemic that accelerated the pace of change. And in this case, led to a very rapid adoption of open science principles, with countries freely sharing data, researchers openly collaborating across the world, and publishers offering free, immediate open access to research papers. It really has proven that open science is the way of doing science in the 21st century. Science that is open, collaborative, shared, transparent, and responsible. And, you know, as I was thinking of the talk today, I was trying to recall when I first became aware or involved in open science principles. And as it increasingly happens as you grow older, you learn about these novel concepts and initiatives through your PhD students. And it was in fact what happened in this case. It was one of my PhD students years ago, Greer Gosnell, who first spoke to me about open science principles. It was about 5 years ago. She had gone to the US on a research trip and she became aware of it. And she realized how fundamental it was. And she wished she had known about these principles when she started her PhD journey. And so she started advocating for the importance of raising awareness and the need for training in open science principles and methods. And the outcome of her advocacy is that we hosted in my department of Geography and Environment, what I think was the first ever research transparency and reproducibility training at LSE. It was in January 2018, and it was open to PhD students and interested researchers. And the training was over 2 days, and it was based on the resources and training from the Berkeley Initiative for Transparency in the Social Sciences, which Greer had become aware of. So participants learned about the range of then innovative open science practices and tools to do with transparency, research ethics, data management, version control, and just overall methods that can ensure the reproducibility and transparency of our hypothesis and analysis. And it was focused on things and approaches that participants could use straight away in their own research immediately. So people were very enthusiastic about it. And I think it's from there that things started to move on in our department. The workshop included, for example, and I recall because it's the first time I ever heard of it, pre-registration. We had training on pre-registration. So the registration of study designs and pre-analysis plans in public repositories prior to the data collection. So now, 5 years later, I regularly do this for the experiments that I'm involved in, and I advocate it across the projects that I'm involved in. And a lot of people have still not heard about these things. But it was the first time 5 years ago that I learned about this. So it wasn't that long ago. The workshop was a success. We ran a second one in February 2020, just before the pandemic hit. And Helen was one of the speakers at that second workshop. So around the same time, in my discipline, of environmental economics, awareness of open science was growing. It was also around 5 years ago. It was more prevalent in STEM than in the social sciences. So it was sort of a new thing for environmental economics. So around 2018, Professor Paul Ferraro, who's a leading environmental economist from Johns Hopkins University, he was doing the conference rounds, and he was delivering a fascinating keynote on whether there was a replicability crisis in environmental and resource economics. And I had talked about this before, and he was doing keynotes on this. And he talked about widespread practices, such as selectively reporting results or using designs with low statistical power. And he critiqued the professional incentives that encourage these practices. It was a fascinating and thought-provoking talk. I watched it twice in different conferences, and he had packed rooms, standing room only, lots of people discussing this and realizing that, you know, these things were happening and weren't talked about. And so things began to change in environmental economics then. And Paul Ferraro's paper was since published in 2020 in a leading field journal. So I believe that open science will become the default model for research in the global world, enabled by technology, and this shift will be irreversible. For example, the open access to publications is now mainstreaming. In the UK, our UKRI, UK Research and Innovation, that encompasses the research councils that fund research in the UK, it's a public body, they now require open access for all the research that's published and acknowledges their funding. And the UKRI has also established and is currently recruiting members for a new committee on research integrity called the UK CORI. And this new committee aims to promote research integrity across the UK and internationally, and identify how systemic pressures affect research integrity and harness opportunities for change and improvement. And it will encompass all the various pillars of open science, this committee. So this is a really welcome development here in the UK. Now, today, the CIVICA Alliance offers the opportunity to collaborate and raise awareness and the advancement of open science within our institutions, and through developing common frameworks to support communities of practice, and researching in particularly what open science means for social science research, because it's not as advanced in social science as it is in STEM. This event today intends to start these conversations to help inform our open science plans for the CIVICA network, with a focus on social sciences, but also more broadly to promote and foster best practice in open science across our institutions. And that's all I wanted to say. I hand over to Helen to introduce the first roundtable. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Susanna, for this engaging introduction to lead us into the rest of the event. So we just wanted to take a quick look at the agenda. And as Susanna said, for the first half of this event, we really want to explore open science as it specifically relates to social sciences. This will be followed by an exploration of how CIVICA institutions can collaborate and what the Alliance will really allow us to do to advance open science at our institutions. So to kick off, before we get into the roundtables, we just wanted to talk very briefly about open science. So if we just go on to the next slide, on open science. We know that from the initial surveys sent out and meetings that we've had so far, that Civica institutions are at the beginning of a cultural change towards open science. So although we already have very established services to support open access and research data, for example, open science in its wider definition is much less visible in our institutions. So to kick off today, we have taken as an example some of the open science principles and areas of focus defined and developed by the UCL Office for Open Science, around which they are building communities and services. So many of the discussions we are already having and plans we are making at Civica will touch on these areas. What we'd really like to do is to get your input on which of these principles are of most interest to you as researchers or members of professional services at Civica institutions or indeed elsewhere. So my colleague Cecile is now going to post 2 quick polls and we'd like everybody to answer these 2 questions. So which 3 elements of open science do you think are the most important? And which of these 2 principles are you least familiar with? So if you just take a minute or so just to fill in those, that would be wonderful. And Sophie and Cecile, let us know when we've got participants that have voted enough to be able to look at some of the results.
Yes, almost 50. Oh, almost 50%. Yeah. Yes, 50. Oh, yes, that's great. 65%. We are approaching the maximum.
Brilliant.
Yes.
So maybe we can end it right now, and we will share the results.
Yes.
So do you see the results? Yeah.
Yes, we can see the results. So obviously we've got research. I wasn't able to vote as a panelist, but I would have voted for research integrity. So it's interesting to see that this one is the top one there. Looks like followed by fair data, which is obviously a huge part of research integrity also. And then shortly followed by knowledge and skills development. This is something we really want to develop as part of Civica, as we know that there's a lot of work that we can do in this area across our institutions. Sophie, Cecile, do you want to comment on any of those results, or Natalie?
No, I guess what you told Helen is the first remark about research integrity. That's really interesting, and I think we already do many things in our institutions on that subject. No, it's really a nice result when we compare to our objectives within Civica Alliance. So I'm really happy with that.
I think we can take this forward. And when we actually do our work on the Civica packages and so on, we will take all this feedback into account and make sure that we know what are the priorities for attendees as well. So it's excellent feedback that we've received. Thank you.
Yeah, and looking at the second question about which are people least familiar with, we've got next generation metrics there, and that's really interesting that people are the least aware of this area of work. And quite a lot of people, although say fair data is very important, quite a lot of people aren't familiar with it. So maybe this is something that we really need to focus on in our institutions to really increase the profile of FAIR principles in what we're doing. So no, this is great. Thank you very much for participating.
Yes, Helen.
Yeah, sure.
I think we just have a question or
sure.
a remark about the order in which choices are presented. Does that influence the results of this poll? That's a good question, because we ordered them as they appear on the slide. But well, the question maybe is about the last item there, the knowledge and skills development. What do you think?
I would say that I would hand it over to one of our social science researchers to see how we've influenced in this way. But yeah,
I think this is a problem in polling, which is known as the donkey vote. But I'm hoping that our audience are sufficiently discriminating that they wouldn't be influenced by the research, the order that's there.
Thank you, Patrick. Okay, so many thanks for taking part and providing this broad picture of your interests and awareness, which, as we've all said, will be really useful for us. So I'm now very pleased to introduce the panelists for the first of our main discussions today. So joining Roundtable 1 to address the drivers, barriers and best practice for open science in the social sciences are Professor Patrick Dunleavy, Emeritus Professor of Political Science and Public Policy, and also Editor-in-Chief of our LSE Press and Open Access Press. Joining him will be Professor Miklos Coron, Professor of Economics at CEU, Matteo Galizzi, Associate Professor of Behavioural Science at LSE, and Denisa Kostovicheva, Associate Professor in Global Politics, also at LSE. Before I hand over to Patrick to lead the discussions, I just wanted to remind participants to add any questions in the chat, as we will be having a short Q&A with the panellists after their initial discussions. So Patrick, over to you.
Okay, well, maybe I could move to the next slide, which seems to have disappeared off my screen. Just the slide after this one. Oh, yes. Okay, so basically, I think there was something missing from the list of attributes of open science that were considered before, and which we took from University College London. And I think this missing element is very well covered in this core diagram from a body known as the Turing Way. I should have put the URL on here, but the Turing Way is a site, it's a story, and it's full of tools and think pieces and all the requirements that you might need to develop your open science practice. And what the diagrams show is that really open science is about producing results that are reproducible, replicable, robust, and generalizable. And so a lot of angst has followed in the STEM sciences, where we've found that one or other of these criteria hasn't been met. What does each of them actually mean? Well, for research to be reproducible, it's a fairly simple, straightforward test. We take the same data set and we use the same analysis, but different teams implement the analysis, and we should get to the same results. So the picture that we get at the bottom of the little reproducible bit is the same picture for the researcher on the left and the researcher on the right. And obviously, that reproducibility element relies on the data being available and also on people documenting in a full way and a useful way what kind of analysis they've undertaken and how they treated the variables and so on. So that's the first and most minimal thing that we would hope social science research will do. If two different research teams look at the same data and they use the same methods, do they get to the same picture? Moving across to, is it replicable? Well, here we're trying to be a bit more ambitious. So we're perhaps getting different data sets, and in social sciences we have lots and lots of problems with different data sets because we don't have single large master data sets that everybody uses. We often have data sets collected by one researcher, data sets collected by another. This one has these countries in, or these subnational governments, or whatever it is, and covers this time period, and the other data set covers different things. So here we're thinking about, if we get different data sets, but we apply the same analysis to them, do we find that the research generates the same picture? Now, of course, if the data sets are a little bit different in terms of specification, it might not be exactly the same, but do we essentially see confirmatory results coming from different studies? And that's what replicability is really about. Then if we move to the bottom left criterion, is the research robust? So supposing the same data set is looked at using different methods by different teams, different analysis methods, do we get to the same picture from both kinds of analysis? Do we get, in a sense, a kind of triangulation across different methods, particularly, for example, quantitative and qualitative methods, or different kinds of quantitative methods, or different kinds of qualitative methods? And then finally, the last of the criteria on the bottom right of your screens is about, is the research generalizable? So if we take different kinds of data and we apply different kinds of analyses, do we tend to find that we get the same basic picture being produced by different research teams? And so obviously, the social sciences are not the STEM sciences. We don't have a kind of assumption that there's a law of nature that's going to be applicable, and or a law of mathematics necessarily that's going to be applicable and applying across lots of different situations. But nonetheless, we should be hoping to get to generalizable results, so that we can say similar things about similar sorts of situations. And in particular, unless we get to generalizable results, how are we going to map things forward into the future? How are we going to advise policymakers with new situations, and so on? So that's the basic setup of what I think, we're really trying to achieve by moving towards open science. We're moving away from social science as, my results show this, their results show that, mine are better, etc., etc., moving towards trying to get to a confirmed and dynamically progressing and evolving and getting better kind of replicable, robust, generalizable, and reproducible research. Now, somebody who's got a lot of expertise in this area is Miklos Coron, who's Professor of Economics at the Central European University. And I'd like to go straight to him and ask, we can get rid of the slide now, I think, and ask Miklos to say a few words about his practice and so on. Miklos.
Thank you very much.
Get rid of the slide altogether from the screen. We don't want to go to, thanks. So Miklos.
Thanks a lot, Patrick, and thanks very much for the invitation to be part of this panel. This is a great pleasure for me to talk about this. You'll see why. One of the hats that I'm wearing today is, as an economist, and I'll talk about that, how economics fits within the social sciences and in the open science movement. But another hat is I'm the data editor of the Review of Economic Studies. And a data editor might be a tricky job title. Of course, I'm not editing data, and you shouldn't either. It's maybe a more appropriate title would be Chief Reproducibility Officer or something. So we are reviewing articles, and we're reviewing the replication packages submitted with the articles to make sure that that our standards are met. And so in that capacity, I'm talking a lot to fellow data editors at other economics journals. We even have a social science data editors website where we try to do this discussion and maintain some common set of resources. So based on this experience, I'd like to talk a little bit about general reproducibility and replicability in general, but then zoom in quite fast to what I think are special challenges or special questions for social science and economics in particular. And then I would like to give a bit of an example in my own research, how I use some of these practices and how I think they benefit my research. So basically what we do as social science data editors is three things. We would like to set standards for reproducibility. And I think it's important because these standards will vary discipline by discipline a little bit. So there's an overall open science movement, and I think in practically every discipline there has been a replication crisis, economics included, but there's going to be some variation across disciplines because the questions are different, the methods are a little bit different, the data sets that we are using are different, but sometimes it's just really path dependence and the way people have been doing research, and we really have to meet researchers where they are. I can tell them to do this, but if they are here, it's very hard to get these ideas across. The second thing we do is to educate the authors submitting to these journals about these standards, why these are important, how they are beneficial to them. And the third thing is to enforce them. So we are, that's where we're really ensuring that they are being met. And this is actually a bit of a strange role because I think people understand that being the most important job of a data editor is to make sure that the rules are being followed. And this is actually a very confrontational representation of our job, where we want to make sure that authors are not cheating. And I think actually 80–90% of our job is mostly about education. And so in that spirit, we thought a lot about what is it in economics in particular that's special. One thing that's so, for example, relative to the STEM sciences, I think we're more likely to be using secondary data rather than primary data. So it's not that we have a lab where we are generating our own measurement, although these of course happen as well. But very often there's the use of administrative data or published statistics. And very often these data sets are confidential or proprietary. So that is actually a big challenge in economics, at least. Often these data sets are relatively smaller, so we can think of, if possible, and actually publishing them practically together with the article. Although here the trends are, towards more bigger and bigger data sets. And a little bit, so I think these are fairly general in other social science disciplines as well. To be more econ specific, one thing that is setting the landscape that's very different from the natural sciences is that most journals in economics are, maybe not most, but a good chunk of journals are society journals, not like for-profit journals run by big publishing houses. And I think it has a number of implications for the capacity to build big teams to educate and enforce these open science standards, but it has a number of other implications for how we actually go about enforcing replicability. Another econ specific fact is that there's this tendency for economists to kind of always refer to natural sciences. It's there's some mathematical, let's bring in some mathematical modeling, do a very rigid proof of our statements. And I like, actually, when I speak to authors, I like to use that as an analogy that when we're making statements and now it's expected to formally prove a theorem, as opposed to just have like a verbal discussion of that statement. we also expect the authors, if they do a statistical analysis, to provide the code and the data underlying that analysis. And so that is actually, that's an analogy that I think economists can relate to very well, because very often the pushback I get from authors is, why do I have to do all of this? It's extra hoops that I have to jump through, and what are the benefits? What are the benefits for this? And so, of course, as enforcers of standards, there's basically the force of fiat. You have to do this because I tell you have to do this, otherwise you're not getting published. But that's not the right way to explain things, because I think in general, some of these best practices are actually useful throughout the research, not at the very last stage when you wanna get published. And when I think about the benefits for researchers themselves, which are kind of less confrontational, because there are some that are very directly where the public and the private interest are fairly opposing. So, for example, data embargoes. I know in economics, it seems to be that the consensus is that we don't do that. So if your only argument for not publishing your data is that you want to work more on that data, then it's not a valid argument. You should share the data as soon as you publish any paper about that. But I understand that in different disciplines, that's different.
You were going to mention some aspects of your own practice or experiences with
yeah, so one example, so just last year I was working on a COVID-related paper, and looking at the business disruption effect of social distancing measures, and we understood very well that time is of the essence if you want to we want to do things really, really fast. And so one thing we started very early on is that we had this reproducibility idea in mind already at the very start of the project. So when we collect data, already save the documentation of the data, make sure that the licenses are all in order, the data citations are in order, and not come back at the end of the project as a second thought, hey, we should have thought about that, because we won't have time to do this at the end. We were using version control for all of the analysis code. We were automating the analysis with makefiles, and really how it benefited us is when we got back from the journal a request for revision, we could complete that revision in 5 hours, because we understood what we have to do. We just change this little piece of the code, we download a little more of the same data set that we had already documented well enough, and so in 5 hours we could return the article back to the editor. Which is, of course, I'm not saying that's what you want to do all the time, but basically I think the number one benefit of some of these reproducible practices are our future selves, that when we get back the same paper for revision, we can actually work with it better. So sharing with others is a great way of doing research, but I think the primary beneficiaries are researchers themselves.
Do you ever use things like sort of some STEM science people now are using these computerized lab notebooks where they record all the coding choices that they make, whether they exclude cases or whatever, all the detailed things that in the past were sort of a very hidden part of lab practice are beginning to be documented. Is this something that economists are beginning to do as well?
That's a very new phenomenon. I personally have explored some of these platforms, and I find them fascinating, but I have to say I haven't used them in my own research yet. It's an important question. How do you record steps you have not taken or you have taken and then turn back?
Because I remember there was some controversy about some work by Rogoff and Reinhardt, where a New England university master's student basically discovered that various kind of potentially dodgy exclusions of countries and data points and so on had skewed the results a bit. And I just wondered whether there was any sort of general move in that way within economics to sort of document the internal choices that you've made. It's a very hard thing to do, and a lot of philosophical research shows that explicit and implicit knowledge go together. It must be a very difficult thing for you as the data editor as well to try and get people to bring that sort of implicit knowledge out in what's being recorded.
Yeah, I think that's a very important concern, and I think that's a limitation of what we do, because as data editors, because we really see the final product, and sometimes we can explore the boundaries a little bit, but it's very hard if you only see the final product and you didn't see how the author really ended up there. I mean, one thing that I think is relatively easy implementation is to just keep a written kind of a lab notebook or a journal thing. And you maybe not share it, but at least you have a record of the kind of steps that you have taken. And then in the case of a controversy, then you can actually maybe share it with the editors. I don't know if that's a wide practice, but I think that would be helpful definitely in all disciplines.
Excellent, Nikos. Thank you very much. That's been really, really very helpful and illuminating. Perhaps we could move on now to Matteo Galizzi, who is Associate Professor of Behavioral Science at LSE. Matteo, would you like to tell us about what open science means for you and how it affects your practice and so on?
Thank you very much, Patrick and Ellen and Susanna, for the invitation. It's really a great pleasure and an honor to be here as a panelist. And I'm in the Department of Psychological and Behavioral Science, which is an interdisciplinary department. And I call myself a behavioral scientist, but I've been trained in experimental and behavioral economics. So that is going to affect a bit what I'm going to say, in a sense that the first that actually start talking about the reproducibility crisis were arguably in social sciences, the psychologists and the behavioral scientists. And they noticed that they first talked about the replication crisis, and they noticed that was partly arising because of a lack of research transparency at different stages of the research pipeline, as partly as a lack of incentives at both individual and institutional level to adopt open and transparent research practices. So there is clearly an absolute emphasis on the transparency of research, which is inherently related to the reproducibility of science. And that emphasis on transparency is absolutely central, not only to the Berkeley initiative on transparency in social sciences that was mentioned by Susanna, but also, for example, to the mission and the activities by the UK Reproducibility Network, which is a UK-based network led by Marcus Munafort, Laura Fortunata, Chris Chambers, and colleagues. And the network brings together 57 local networks of researchers, including LSE, 20 institutions, 37 external stakeholders, funders, publishers, and societies, to coordinate action and reproducibility and work to ensure that the UK remains and retains its place as a center of the world leading research. To be fair, this trend in social science is reflecting a more general trend in STEMs and medicine. Think back, for example, in 2005 paper, very provocative by John Ioannidis in 2005, arguing that most published research findings are false, including and specifically targeting medical randomized controlled trials. And it's also worth noticing that concerns about the transparency and reproducibility of science can be traced back to Charles Babbage in 1833, the polymath academic in England and father of the computer, but also re-emerge regularly in the 60s, in the 70s and 90s and so on. So in social sciences, the terms reproducibility and replicability originally comes from the experimental psychology people, but rapidly spread across the other experimental branches of social sciences, experimental economics, environmental economics, environmental studies, as mentioned by Susanna, but also experimental political science and so on, experimental finance, experimental policy, sociology, philosophy, and so on. So what is reproducibility for these experimental social scientists is at a very minimum, as Patrick was mentioning, is a matter of reproducing the same experiment in the same context and using the same analysis, we should be able to get the same results. And so hence the importance of sharing the protocol, sharing the material, sharing the data when the study is published or available, and so that other peer scholars can replicate the analysis. But along the journey, there have been a couple of considerations. First of all, that for an experiment to be reproducible, that probably will not be enough to learn something about a new scientific finding, in a sense that besides reproducibility, we want to get move about robustness, generalizability and replicability of results, as explained by Patrick before. And generalizability is now very central in social sciences, in experimental psychology, in experimental behavioral science, in experimental economics, because it has to do with how generalizable are, for example, different behavioral intervention across different samples, across different settings, across different cultures, across different conditions, and the dramatic urgency of knowing more about those issues was highlighted, as mentioned also by Susanna before, by the pandemic, the response to the pandemic. How can we really make sure that we learn something about the behavioral intervention that are in different countries, which are generalized universally across different countries? That's the first consideration. The second consideration is related to another moment where reproducible sciences can be made, not just sharing data or protocol after the study, but actually in starting with some practices even before the data collection. For example, two quite powerful tools in reproducible social sciences mentioned also by Susanna are pre-registration, basically is your study protocol. There is a timestamp record of decision around the study design, methods, and analysis that is created before data collected around becoming accessible. The pre-registration then is made publicly available on a registry, a repository, and can be accessed by anyone. But also registry reports, which are used now in psychology, in some of the behavioral science journal, not so much as far as I know in other disciplines, basically are a type of journal article that involves a peer review of the background, the study design, the methods, and the analysis plan, a stage one manuscript, before the data are even collected. So if the proposed study is accepted by the journal, then the study results will be published regardless of the outcome, regardless of the findings in terms of statistical significance, for example. And then the second stage of the review will only focus on checking whether the researcher follow the pre-analysis plan, basically. Those are potentially powerful tools to, for example, to encourage transparent pre-specification of outcomes, stimulating a bit more discussion in the very early life cycle moment of the research, and focusing the reviews on basically on the design, for example, the research question, rather than the results. And also, as you can imagine, these can be tools also to reduce the questionable research practices such as arcing, the hypothesizing after the results are known, or p-hacking or data phishing, to reduce the false discovery rates, to mitigate the publication bias and the file drawer problem. So I think there is an inherent alignment between reproducibility of science, transparency, and open openness of science, in my view. And I completely see the moment as very timely, in a sense that there is now a call by the UKRI for setting up a committee on the research integrity. And so it's very timely that we start having a conversation about this issue in CIVICA, and LSE.
Let me just check with you on this, because some people who haven't heard about it may be interested in this, how you answer on this. I mean, is pre-registering questions and so forth designed to make sure that you get kind of critical feedback on the questions before you go into the field? Or is it designed to stop you recombining variables and so forth in a kind of p-hacking way afterwards? I've never been totally clear on which of these is the main driver.
Yeah, no, thank you, Patrick. I think that pre-registration is aiming to do to facilitate both things. Pre-registration is a kind of pre-analysis plan, which is kind of tying the ends of a researcher before looking at the data, by specifying the research question, the level of the analysis, and also, for example, the subgroup level of the analysis. So if you want to look at some partition of the data, you need to specify in advance rather than doing after, because you don't find, for example, an effect overall. But also, to some extent,
doesn't that inherently limit any kind of in-process learning by the experiment, as well as, I mean, it stops malpractice, but it also stops good practice in terms of very often it's quite hard to anticipate how data sets are going to work until you start analyzing them. Doesn't pre-registration tie your hands there and prevent you from really learning on the job, so to speak?
Yeah, is an excellent point. But pre-registration per se tie the ends on the primary research question of the researcher, but in no way prevent the researcher to engage in what is in psychology is called unregistered question, but exploratory analysis. So basically, that doesn't prevent the researcher then move beyond the primary research question and engage in more granular data analysis after the collection, and also look at different types of questions when looking at the data. So I don't think there is the pre-registration doesn't prevent the researcher to still look at the data after. It simply make the primary research question that were expected before more transparent and binding in a sense.
Good. Thank you ever so much. That's very helpful. I think we should move on swiftly to our final panelist, who is Denisa Kostovikova. I must get that right, Denisa. And Denisa is Associate Professor of Global Politics at LSE, and a very experienced researcher in both qualitative and quantitative ways. And obviously the qualitative social sciences have so far been those that have been most resistant to open science practices. So Denisa, having a foot in both camps, so to speak, is a very helpful expert for us. Denisa, over to you. Tell us how you see the issues.
Thank you very much, Patrick, and thank you very much, Helen and Sophie, for the invitation to contribute. I've prepared some slides, so I just wondered if these could be shared. What I would do, I was asked to refer to my own research, so I apologize, this is going to be driven by my experience of my work concretely. And I want to talk about open science.
Sophie, could we see Denise's slides, please? Or Cecile, somebody controlling the slides?
Open science in terms of, so they can catch up with the slides if there is an issue. In terms of sharing academic outputs, such as articles, and separately, I'll address issues of sharing data, sort of having open data. So when it comes to academic outputs, right, so, but the slides were just, they're integrated, that's right, yes. So they're there. So if you can just click the next one, please. Perfect. Excellent. That's it. So we're talking about visibility, and here, not just visibility in terms of visibility to the researcher, but visibility to topics and knowledge. So, for example, an article on gender-based violence for a political economy perspective, very, very marginal topic, an unexplored topic, can get huge numbers of views within days of publication. And this is very important for, as I said, expansion of knowledge, new perspectives, but also who checks out. And here we come to the issues that were mentioned previously in terms of democratization of knowledge. And I think of it more about geography of equality. And if I may say, I judge this just by the places from which requests by academics come to me and say, can you please download this article for me because we can't have access. Hugely important issue because sort of addresses the question sort of who creates knowledge, right? And all the sort of global inequalities that that we maintain by safe sort of limiting access. Very important also when it comes to open access and everybody being able to download your work is greater scrutiny. Also talking about academic scrutiny, sort of going beyond just reading an abstract, but also by research participants. For those of us working qualitative methods and who engage with live human research participants, who work on topical issues, very important that they want to check out, so what was the outcome of my participation in that research? We could debate sort of what kind of new reality this kind of scrutiny creates and implications for research, but I think it's very important. Can I have the next slide, please? At LSE, we sort of are very focused also on policy impact of our research. So not just kind of broadening theoretical horizons, but making sort of rethinking how that new knowledge impacts policy. And I think here, again, it is essential to what extent open access is changing the game. And if you apologize, my referring to an own example is that within days of an article in which I and a colleague identified a novel dimension of the inequality in terms of how women participate in public debates in the context of peacemaking, I was approached by the Netherlands Institute for Multi-Party Democracy, who work on the feminist leadership issues. And within weeks of that, I joined a meeting to present the research to 70 members of their network. And we had people from Myanmar, Colombia, Uganda, and Sierra Leone joining in this meeting, being very interested in how the research can help their advocacy. Here, I would just make a little footnote and say that this was an example of, if you like, direct pathway to policy impact. But very often there are cases where, for example, think tanks hyperlink an article, and because they have different audiences and different interlocutors, for example, State Department, here, Foreign Office and others, that the traffic and exposure comes indirectly through these think tanks. Can I have the next slide, please? Here, I would like to sort of move on to sharing data. And this is where sort of it is more sort of prominent or obvious to talk about not just benefits, but also tensions. And immediately, when it comes to sharing qualitative data, we get into the issues and tensions with our commitments to research ethics. I'm still at the previous slide. So sharing data, especially when we talk about qualitative research, then risks us violating the research ethics principles to which we are committed. Again, conflict and post-conflict research is not sort of the only field. This is a key principle of ethical research, whatever you study. but it is more prominent. And the issues of anonymization do not necessarily solve the problem. But on the plus side, and this is, I'm coming back to this idea and this very important point I had at the very beginning, sharing of data, being transparent about the evidence that we bring to our research is extremely important for the legitimacy of our research. Especially in the context of topic and subject that we study, which are very polarizing, very normative, and when researchers' arguments or scholarly arguments can be if you like, dismissed easily on the basis of ideology, showing how that knowledge was generated creates very important legitimacy for knowledge. And can I go to the last slide, please? So this brings me to another important point, and that is the issue of what happens when we share data, which is quantitative. I address this issue again from the research ethics perspective. And here I think that we have been locked in some sort of dual kind of false dichotomy or sort of false differences between qualitative and quantitative research, especially from the perspective of research ethics dilemmas that come into play, in that it's often been thought, and excuse me from saying this cynically, that almost numbers are sort of innocent from the perspective of research ethics, right? They don't disclose anything in contrast to statements, interviews. However, I think the initial sort of the conversations, especially in political science, international relations, are starting to basically sort of question this principle. There's much more research on an understanding of the ethical dilemmas, even in quantitative research, and to what extent publishing data, for example, if it's geocoded, right, that can, for example, let's say, identify pockets of resistance or whatever that may kind of endanger the participants, and that therefore comes into tension with sort of other drivers for publishing data. I put here the problem of irreplicability because, for example, if you then anonymize your data to the extent that you are complying with your ethics principles, you can change the data so much that cannot be sort of reproduced, and your results cannot be repeated. Loads of problems. Here I have, for example, text of verdicts of war crimes in Serbia, on which I'm working at the moment. Do you rely on the authorities to anonymize them, or you do your own anonymization and redaction? I'll just put it out as a question. But again, there is, again, a very important, the idea of legitimacy, especially, as I said, on sort of tricky and sensitive issues like this, opportunity for improving data and therefore improving knowledge if sort of, you know, what others have done. And another sort of problem, sort of the challenge that I would like to conclude with, and especially from the perspective of being a PI and a researcher as well on a project, and that is the sequencing, right? And when, at which point do we make data available and how that fits in with the project cycle. And of course, for example, within the cycle of researchers' plans for publications. So often what happens is that we have to publish data because we have one article, hoping that we can publish few more publications of that. The data is out there, so that kind of creates sort of a big sort of, I would say, a question mark. How do you sequence these commitments? And I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Denisa. That's been very interesting, and especially, of course, the problem of, you know, the often straightforward clash between preserving anonymity if you've done non-attributable interviews, say, and also releasing interview transcripts, because the more data you release, the more it might be possible for people to, you know, push past the non-attributable shield, if you see what I mean. So I think the whole practice of how we do that is evolving very fast here, and it's a very important area for people, even people starting their PhDs and so on now, how you're going to handle this this set of issues. Sadly for me, I have to go to another CIVICA conference, and so I'm going to hand over the next stage of the process to Helen Porter. Let me just say thank you very much to Miklos, Matteo, and Denisa. Now, Helen's going to marshal you for the question and answer sessions, but I'm profoundly grateful for all of your contributions, which were very helpful and very timely. So with that, I'm going to have to say farewell. So,
thank you, Patrick. Sophie, I just want to check in with you. I can see a couple of questions in the chat or comments. Do we want to address these at the end and proceed with the second roundtable, or should I go ahead and do the comments and questions now?
Well, it's really either, but I think that we have at least a question to be asked now, and then we can do the other after the second roundtable.
Sure. So I have got, Natalie, pick me up if I haven't picked one, but one question we've got here is from Peter Sazu, who says he'd be interested to know people's views about various forms of open peer review in which refereed on a paper, and perhaps even their reports are made public. Yes, so the process by which peer review comments are made public. So yes, if maybe I'll go to Denisa first on that one, if you want to say something here, Denisa.
Yes, I'm all for open peer review.
Yeah,
I think peer review has the whole process. I think the envisages anonymous to allow freedom, I think, has been sort of resulting, so produce in practice, generating, I would say, some habits that are not necessarily helpful either for the improvement and sort of the peer check on the publication, and judging from how I'm sort of attuned to the debates, and especially how younger researchers are affected by these processes. Also, I would say that at some level also unethical in tone, and I think that you cannot really sort of divorce the nourishing of science and the nourishing of scientists. And this doesn't mean not being robust, not being critical, and not being to the point. So I would strongly support that. Certainly, whenever I write a review, I actually always write it in a sense that I would be happy for everyone to see it, to help, to be critical, and for me to be accountable. And I think that veil of anonymity stands in the way.
Thank you, Denisa. Matteo, I can see you're nodding. Do you want to add to what Denisa said?
No, just to add that I'm all in favor of the combination of pre-registered report and then open access peer reviews. I think that will be quite a nice, transparent change in some of the journal. Yeah, but
Miklos. Oh, sorry, Matteo. Miklos, you put your hand up.
Yeah, so just to, I broadly agree with the idea that you know, making reviewers more accountable is a good thing. So sometimes I read horror stories on Twitter about, you know, reviewer number 2. But there's also the issue of depending on the power dynamic, how senior the author, junior the reviewer, how honest that review will be if it's signed or if it's made public. So I think the balance is between these two forces. I would tend to read it probably very discipline by discipline. I would be a little more in favor of more openness, but it would have to be case by case or journal by journal, because sometimes there's the other force as well, that you don't want to kind of inflate your reviews because your fear of retribution or any other dynamics might be happening.
Thank you. And I think, thank you all once again for your participation. I know some of you have to leave shortly. I know Denise is staying on, but I'm going to pass over to Sophie now, who's going to move on with our second roundtable. So thank you all.
Thank you all. Thank you, Helen. So I think this first roundtable gave us the opportunity to better understand the real cultural change that open science imply for, well, the whole research ecosystem. So now we would like to address the question from the perspective of an organization, namely the CIVICA Alliance. So the question of this second roundtable is, how can we develop open science within the CIVICA Alliance and in a collaborative way, of course? So to address this question and provide some answers, we will keep Denisa on board, and we will also welcome Guillaume Plantin. So unfortunately, Paola Dubini from Bocconi University, who was also invited, had a last-minute emergency, so she could not join us. So thank you all. Let me at first introduce Guillaume Plantin. So Guillaume is Professor of Economics, Vice President for Research at Sciences Po, and Scientific Coordinator of CIVICA Research Project. So first of all, I suggest that Guillaume takes the floor, and then Denisa may go on, and then we will open up the discussion. Hopefully we have time with questions and comments from the audience. So thank you again, Denisa, for staying with us. And Guillaume, could you tell us a bit more about you and about how you, European university like CIVICA, could set up an ambitious and valuable action plan to promote and foster more openness of result with the researchers, of research results with the researchers. So thank you, Guillaume.
Thank you very much, Sophie. Thank you to the organizers and the participants for the first roundtable. That was, I found, very interesting and really showcases what we're trying to do at CIVICA on the open science work package, but also on all the other work packages, which is really have a bottom-up approach. CIVICA is comprised of fairly well-run institutions. They're used to have this bottom-up approach and listen to researchers and their faculty first when building up projects, and with the kind of roundtable like the one we had right now. And I think it's really what we want to do is ask researchers first how they think we can help them with that new institutional creation, which is our European Alliance. So yeah, when I, as the coordinator of CIVICA Research, I was in charge with my team at Sciences Po to write down the CIVICA Research project. It was before the pandemic. It seemed like it was ages ago, but it was obvious to us from scratch that we had to devote a significant number of pages and of budget to the open science agenda, and that's why we have a whole work package dedicated to it. And I'm very grateful to the LSE for having accepted the lead on that work package. What were the broad goals I had in mind when I wrote that up? With again keeping in mind that we really want to learn by doing, and we value the inputs from the scientific communities to see how we can put flesh on the skeleton that we wrote up in that project and what will be most useful to the researchers. But here are the four main broad goals that we had in mind when we wrote that project. First, we thought that open science was simply a way to maximize the visibility of the CIVICA researchers. CIVICA is a new brand. It's a brand on top of already well-known academic brands, the CIVICA members. And we thought that if we could coordinate our actions at the level of open science, that was the best way to advertise the new CIVICA brand with one of the two important things we do, research next to teaching. So there was this idea of maximizing the visibility of CIVICA via joint open science approaches to the extent that they're feasible. At least we wanted to explore that. The second idea we had in mind was strength in numbers. I think CIVICA is the only, to my knowledge, is the only specialized European alliance. Of all the alliances that have been funded thus far by the European Commission, we're the only one that specialized in social sciences. And furthermore, I think we're the most homogeneous alliance in the sense that all the members of CIVICA are institutions that are very international within their own country compared with other academic institutions. They're among the ones that are the most open to the global academic activity. And being very homogeneous, this way, gives us an edge at some form of lobbying action. So as was said during the first roundtable, there are very strong specificities for social sciences when we think about open science. We do very specific things, and our way, especially in the European institutions, compared with STEMs and other disciplines, is not always what it should be. So we think that it's very useful to have this CIVICA lobby to the extent that we can agree on a number of important things, and I'm sure we'll be able to over the course of the years. I think the strength in numbers will help us being an important voice for social sciences in the open science debate. So that was definitely the second point. The third point is that from scratch, we had the importance of young researchers in mind when we wrote up CIVICA as a whole, and in particular the open science work package. I like what Susanna said in her opening words, that she first got practical exposure to open science questions to her PhD students. And it's true that open science is particularly relevant for the most recent and innovative ways of conducting research in the social sciences. I'm an old economic theorist. I do chalk and blackboard research. As a researcher, personally, I've never been very exposed to social science questions because, as Miklos said, the Turing framework readily applies to theory. But we think that the challenges of open science will be of utmost importance for the future generations of researchers and for young researchers. So that's why we dedicate a significant amount of our effort to young researchers, for example, with the creation of the program of PhD ambassadors for open science and all the training we plan to develop through the doctoral schools of CIVICA. So a focus on young researchers. And the fourth point I had in mind, and that relates to one of the 4 themes of the CIVICA research agenda, which is the weakening of democracies at the beginning of the liberal democracies at the beginning of the 21st century, is that without being overly optimistic, we think that open science can be a way to fight the skepticism that's rising towards expertise, and in particular towards expertise in social science. It's less and less clear in the public debate what the difference between an opinion and a statement that's the output from research using state-of-the-art methodologies are. The public is not always aware of it. Social networks, to some extent, are very helpful to diffuse research, but they can be very harmful too. And we think that with the degree of higher transparency that open science can provide, that can be a very powerful tool to educate the public and explain what the difference between a scientific statement and an opinion is. So that was, in my view, the 4 broad goals that I'd be very happy to see CIVICA Research reach over these short 3 years. Thank you, Sophie.
Thank you very much, Guillaume. I think your presentation shows that the increased visibility of research results must be really thought in an enabling environment, just as you stated, and several reflections and evolutions must really be carried out to serve this ambition. And you talked about the training of PhD students, but I'm sure there are also reflections on their way there, like the assessment of research or the resources given to support staff, etc. So I would like to invite Denisa to tell us her thoughts about on that subject, and specifically, well, how a European university like CIVICA could help your open science practices, the ones you just explained us, and in other words, what would you expect from CIVICA University as a researcher, maybe also as a teacher, and what could we do in a collaborative way, and at last, maybe what should we be careful or vigilant about as a European university, maybe in the way that we could have a single policy, what we would have to be careful about on that matter. Thank you, Denisa.
Thank you very much. My comments will be somewhat of an ad hoc nature, but I think what is very interesting is that several themes are beginning to emerge of common interest and importance, and I just really thought it was kind of very interesting how what Guillaume outlined as kind of strategic tracks to the project very much speaks to separately to different issues that were raised in the previous panel. So my comments would be along the lines of sort of a broader contribution of this project. I would like to see, and I think it would be very important, having undertaken this exercise, and this panel I found fascinating, and that is to maybe contribute to the rethinking, sort of some self-reflection on actually what does this mean to be an open scientist. You know, we do sort of, we've focused on the practicalities of it, which are very important to understand, both the advantages, broader contributions to science, and the constraints. But actually, what does this mean, right? And I think that is very much related to the question of training of young researchers. So I see sort of a multiple benefits already emerging from the project and from the practice and the training in the practice of open science. I thought the training dimension of it is very important, but I would, if I may, also say not necessarily training that should be directed to just young researchers. I think a broader community could benefit as well. You know, just as we can have mentors for our seniors, we can also learn from juniors. So I think there is a little bit sort of a broader scope from training than just sort of maybe, so it could be more collaborative. I think a very important thing would be to, while we think about sort of addressing inequalities, that we don't create the inequalities, right? The islands sort of practice where open science is possible, And we still know that this practice will not be sort of generally available universally, and maybe to think within CIVICA to lead by example. And I think it's not just collaboration with the partners, but for example, individual scholars collaboration with partners who are outside of CIVICA in areas which are disadvantaged in this kind of global academic world. That would be a huge benefit. So maybe support research like that. And I would like to see when it comes to these ideas of self-reflection, I think this last point that Guillaume made about the world in which we live, where the kind of legitimacy of knowledge and expertise is questioned, that we, through these experience and through the joint work, self-reflect actually of what can be achieved, right? I think it's really important to understand the limitations of open science. And lastly, I would just, and I'm sorry for just not structuring these points better, I would really like to sort of get a better grip on also what is the kind of not just what are the principles of open science and educating those, but what is the open science kind of good diligence, right? What kind of expectations that puts on researchers, and how that trickles in through the sort of the whole production sort of process, academic process of learning, researching, publishing, and contributing to knowledge.
Thank you very much, Denisa. That's really interesting. Thank you for your valuable comments. And it is really important that the CIVICA Alliance allows to reflect on what it means to be an open scientist. And it is really related to your fourth comment about the self-reflection. And so this is really interesting. And that might be really innovative in the CIVICA Alliance. Also, you say about the broader approach of the open science community. So we could not more agree on that as librarians, but the community has really to be large and integrate young researchers and also all the support staff, I think. Do you, Guillaume, want to maybe have the last word about this second roundtable? Because I think we do not have many time left.
Sure. So back on Denisa's last point, I think in the longer run, so during these first years and these first 2 years, the main goal of the Alliance will be to explore what we have in common already and how further we're willing to go. But we already know that there would be another round of funding for the successful alliances, both by Erasmus and for research. And because we're all very enthusiastic about CIVICA, we're trying to have a longer view and see what we could do in the longer run. And I think that what CIVICA could really contribute to is help researchers manage their projects that's become more and more difficult, both because of the open science movement, which is mostly an opportunity, but also creates constraints that researchers are always aware of. And your point, not only young researchers need to be trained and informed, but also the more senior ones should. In general, it's become more and more difficult because of the ethics consideration, open science considerations to set up and manage projects. I think that's where an alliance comprised of universities, where many projects are managed, where we're used to an international environment, but we're also subject to our own national constraints. I think within CIVICA, we have the ability in the longer run to provide common support for ambitious research project management, in particular regarding the open science aspect. So I think that's going to be very important. That's a gain from an output from CIVICA that I'm very much looking forward to in the longer run.
Thank you, Guillaume. I now ask Helen if we still have time to show our last slide with the next steps for CIVICA Research project as for open science, maybe in 2 or 3 minutes.
Yes, I'll try my best. Thanks, Sophie. Yeah, so finally, what we wanted to do was to really just talk about the specific plans we have. But given the this event and the input we've had, I feel like a lot of this will be informed by what's happened here. So these plans will change slightly, I'm sure. So the work, as everybody's mentioned, can be grouped around the 4 following main elements. So we see it as building open science networks across CIVICA, developing common frameworks and roadmaps, open science indicators and assessments, and knowledge and skills for open science, and the cultural change that we want to achieve. Sophie has coordinated our first package, and I'll just summarise that briefly, Sophie, if that's all right, which we've started to build those networks. So finding out who across institutions has expertise in open science, what tools, what infrastructure we have across CIVICA. So we're just analysing that information at the moment. Following on from this work, we'll take a closer look at the issues of data interoperability and reproducibility that have been featured so much today. So Patrick Dunleavy is going to investigate best practice and barriers across different disciplines in the social sciences. As we've discussed, the differences in qualitative and quantitative research to really give a closer look at what's relevant for the social sciences. Alongside this, we're going to explore how to increase fair practices across CIVICA, for example, integrating fair principles in data management plans, developing a community for CIVICA in a platform such as OSF. We want to provide these tools in such a way that supports the fair principles across the various disciplines in terms of what's expected for metadata, formats and documentation, as Denisa highlighted, what's expected in terms of openness in different disciplines. Our colleague Bogdan Florian is coordinating our work to analyse CIVICA institutions and national policies for embedding open science practices in the evaluation of research. A particular focus will be for, will of course be appropriate metrics for social sciences. So how do we think about the way that open science is assessed? And we hope that this could lead to common objectives such as the signatory of DORA on behalf of the Alliance. Finally, we'd like to work closely with our PhD and early career research communities to develop an online or peer-led training in areas of open science. And we're hoping to do some knowledge exchange work. And as Denisa mentioned, that this could be something that we do for all levels of researchers across CIVICA institutions. And in the course of this project, we'd also very much hope to organise more events like these. So if you have any thoughts on what you'd like to hear about in the future, we would love to hear from you. So the currently funded project very much lays the foundations and recommendations for open science at CIVICA institutions, but we do hope that future projects will provide the resources to implement and introduce systems, services and community practices that will facilitate real change. I'll pass over to Sophie now to round up the event formally. So thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you all. I don't think we have still time for questions, so thank you very much for all your comments. So we hope you enjoyed this event. We will soon send you a sort of satisfaction survey, and in which you can also share your ideas and expectations for future CIVICA events, just like Helen said, around open science. So thank you in advance for answering. And if we do not have any further comments, I have a look at the chat here. Okay. Thank you. So we thank you all again for your contributions, participations, and wish you a nice day.